there! The sun is out today and it may still be really, really cold, but at least it looks like it's a nice day, so it's making me vaguely happy. Today we're going to talk about what disability history looked like and the disability rights movement, because I feel like I know bits and pieces of it, and I've definitely touched on bits and pieces of it on my channel thus far, but I think it would be really nice to be very solid on all of those bits and have a nice little timeline to go back to. So today is that day. I promise it won't be all facts and dates. We're going to get into some of the socio-cultural specifics of some of the events and the fun stuff that happened. So while it may not be, my most riveting video, hopefully you'll still enjoy it. Also, really anything is interesting if the person telling you about it is interested in it or excited about it. So let's get historical. Also, just to clarify, I'm not going to explicitly cover a lot of the history of institutionalization here because I kind of want to make that a different video and go into the depths of that. But it is sometimes obviously tied into this because that is disability history. So it's going to come up a little bit, but if I miss some stuff, that's why. The first date for disability rights in the United States, based on most timelines, we're just going to, ignore how there were happy pockets of completely accessible, half-disabled communities in the US into the 1600s. I should make a video about that too. I'm gonna do that. Anyway, on April 15th, 1817, what is now known as the American School for the Deaf opened in Connecticut, which was the very first formal education for deaf and deaf-blind people in the United States. And it was founded by Laurent Clerc and Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, which doesn't really matter if you don't know anything about the deaf community, but if you do, those names should ring a bell for you, so I just thought I would throw those in. In 1829, a dude named Louis Braille created Braille, which is a system of raised dots that can be read with the fingers and became a widely used tool for the blind. Also, this is a very tiny pet peeve, but some people call Braille a language for the blind while ASL is a language for the deaf. Know that ASL is an official language, very separate from English in its structure and everything, but that Braille is categorized more as a code in the same way that Morse code isn't a new language, it's just a different way of expressing English. Also, fun fact, the creator of Morse code's wife was deaf and he spoke to her by tapping his fingers in her hands, which became the base for his actual code, which is really interesting. His business partner donated all of his wealth that he made off the code for the foundation of a school for the deaf on his estate after his death. But anyway, I digress. Speaking of ASL and deaf people, in 1864, Gallaudet University opened in Washington, D.C., which was the first and one of the only universities for the deaf. Or maybe the only university and then there's a college. NTID, I don't know how that categorizes. Then we have June 19th, 1865, which some of you may remember that date to be the original Juneteenth. That was the day that the last group of enslaved people in Texas learned that they were freed as a result of the Civil War. And this is a very important time in disability history because despite slavery technically being over, though many of us have seen the film 13th and know that that's not entirely true, but you know what I mean, many parents of disabled children actually signed them over to their white landowners, and disabled slavery continued on for decades. One specific example of this is Thomas Wiggins, who was a classical pianist and traveled all over the United States and Europe, making millions of dollars for his owners. He ended up being enslaved for his entire life. This is probably a topic for another video as well. It will take me a while to get around to it, if only because I want to read a book about it. But if you want to read that book, it's called African American Slavery and Disability by D.H. Boster, I think is how you pronounce that. And it's on my reading pile, and I will link in the description for you. But back to our timeline. So in 1867, the first ugly law was passed in San Francisco, and this law prohibited visible disabilities in the public, meaning that anybody seen with deformities, limping, etc. could be fined or institutionalized. The last arrest for these laws was in 1974, when the last ugly law was repealed. In 1880, the National Association for the Deaf, or the NAD, was founded, and later that year there was also a multi-country conference in Milan, Italy, of entirely hearing educators for the deaf to decide the best education methods for deaf children. Without any deaf people present. So that's great. They ruled that sign language should not be allowed in schools, deaf children should only be taught how to speak and lip read, and there are still very many schools for the deaf in the US and around the world based exclusively on this system. It's called oralism. It's really gross. So yeah. Also, I don't think we should be surprised that Alexander Graham Bell was a part of said conference, because he got around. Now, in 1907, as we talked about in my eugenics video, the very first sterilization law went into place in 24 states, followed by a 1927 ruling that affirmed forced sterilization nationwide for the protection and health of the state, which has yet to be overturned. In the 1930s, we know that the Great Depression was a thing, and that's when the League of Physically Handicapped organized and grew in numbers because disabled people were having an exponentially harder time finding work during that time than typically. Also, a lot of timelines about disability rights specifically say that 1932 was a big deal because FDR was elected as our first disabled president, which is a huge milestone, don't get me wrong, but I am going to have to disagree because he was elected more than once without the American population knowing that he was disabled. So like on one level, yes, cool, good for him, love it. But that would be kind of like saying it's a big deal, this is hypothetical, but like that we just elected the first queer president when they didn't come out until like a decade after their term. Like the stigma of that identity didn't hinder them from getting into office. We just found out about it later. So like, great, it shows that we're capable people, but also would people have voted for him if they knew he were disabled? Probably not. So like, yeah, he was a really great dude, and looking back, thank you, sir, that was a huge step, but do with that what you will. In 1934, the National Federation for the Blind was founded. Not much more to say on that topic. A year after that, in 1935, FDR signed the Social Security Act, which established a program of permanent financial assistance for adults with disabilities. 1939 to 1945 was World War II, where anywhere from 75,000 to 250,000 disabled people were killed in the Holocaust. But the war actually did do a lot for disability rights in the long run, because when so many disabled veterans returned from the front, there was a lot of raised pressure for the government to make rehabilitation and vocational training options available and accessible for people. It also raised a lot of awareness about mental health issues and physical disabilities because more people knew disabled people all of a sudden. In 1946, the National Mental Health Foundation was created, and they began fighting for deinstitutionalization. In 1950, disabled veterans, along with other disabled people, began the barrier-free movement to create some national standards for barrier-free buildings, which we talked about in my accessible architecture video. It's really cool, it's really interesting, you can check it out over here. The Association for ARSLR Citizens was also founded in that year. It's now known as the ARC, and they work to change public perceptions of intellectual disability. They have made major changes for services and supports for intellectually disabled people in our country, so cheers for that. Also, if you've seen the film Crip Camp, which I will gush about in a little bit, 1951 is when Camp Jened opened, which was a summer camp made entirely for disabled people, where the disability rights movement kind of majorly began because such a huge community of disabled people was created there, and they all began to understand each other's experiences and realize that disabled people actually deserve to be treated like human beings. But we're going to talk about that a little more in a bit. Just keep that in mind as we continue on. In 1954 was the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, which we all learned about in middle school to be the Supreme Court ruling that abolished segregation in schools, but it also gave public schools legal permission to educate kids with intellectual disabilities. Then in 1960, we have the first Paralympics, which we've also talked about before. And this was the beginning of the decade of the civil rights movement, which ended up expanding to so many other minority groups too, including LGBTQ people and disabled people, and also all of these are typically intercombined. And it was also around this time that we saw a lot of various exposés about the horrors of institutionalization and increased pressures to deinstitutionalize. In 1962, a man named Ed Roberts, a wheelchair user and former Camp Jened camper, applied to UC Berkeley, got rejected, and was able to fight to get that decision overturned. But since there were no accessible dormitories, he lived in the campus hospital. So this inspired the independent living movement, and he and a fellow camper, Judy Heumann, created the very first Center for Independent Living in Berkeley, California. Over time, a lot of their former campers also came to join them, and it became a whole little community, which is a really fun part of the documentary. Crip Camp. I'm always talking about Crip Camp. Anyway, in 1963, JFK signed the Community Mental Health Act, which led to considerable deinstitutionalization, and it changed mental health services in the US. It obviously wasn't perfect, but it did create a lot of hope in the disability community for the future of mental health care in our country. In 1964, we saw the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which protected the rights of people of color and women in the workplace from discrimination. But did you know that actually it didn't say anything about disability and didn't protect us at all? In 1965, ASL was officially recognized as a real language, which actually a lot of people in the deaf community were against at the time. It was a whole thing. We can discuss that at some point. But before then, it was actually widely believed that ASL was just English on the hands or some sort of primitive communication system until a linguist dude actually took the time to study the structure, and he went, oh, this isn't English, and also has a very thorough grammatical structure, very different from English, and it can be used to discuss hypothetical things, which are like the rules for a language. So he declared that it was an official language. In 1968, the Architectural Barriers Act required all buildings designed, constructed, altered, or leased with federal funds be made accessible, which, awesome, cool, great, big deal. but remember that this pretty much only covered federal buildings and colleges because most colleges are federally funded, if you didn't know that. In 1970, Judy Heumann, remember her from earlier, you should keep remembering her, she was denied her teaching license because the New York City Board of Education did not believe that she could get herself or her students out of the building in case of a fire because she was in a wheelchair. So she sued them, and then she became the first wheelchair user to teach in New York City. She taught elementary school for 3 years. In 1973, an act prohibiting discrimination on the basis of disability in the workplace in any federal institution or federally funded program, which again includes higher education, was written, and it was called the Rehabilitation Act, and it was not signed or implemented. Keep this one in mind. We're gonna come back to it in a little bit. In the meantime, we had the removal of homosexuality from the DSM in 1973. Heck yeah, in 1974, the last of the ugly laws were repealed, with the final one being in Chicago. And then in 1975, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA, was signed, which guaranteed a free education for all disabled children in the least restrictive environment. We discussed this in my ADA video. I have opinions. You can watch that one over here as well. But anyway, so back to the Rehabilitation Act. 4 years after the act was written, in April 1977, disabled people, well, they were fed up that this is still yet to be passed. It's been 4 years. So a group of people, led by, you guessed it, Judy Heumann, staged a sit-in at the Health, Education, and Welfare Office in San Francisco, protesting Secretary Califano's refusal to complete the anti-discrimination regulations in Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. The sit-in had more than 150 people and lasted for 25 days, which is the longest occupation of a federal office by protesters in US history. Secretary Califano ended up giving in and signing the regulations after 25 days. Some of my favorite aspects of these protests is that, first of all, it's one thing to do a 25-day sit-in, but as disabled people who didn't have their extra ventilators or allergen-friendly food, who needed to sleep on the floor despite needing to maybe be manually rolled over several times in the middle of the night, or needing a specific kind of mattress so laying down doesn't cause serious damage, this is an extra big deal because they were putting themselves at very serious risk because of this. And I don't want to be like, disabled people are an inspiration, because, you know, they were doing simply what they had to do, but I am still absolutely amazed. Also, the FBI kept trying to get them to leave, so they cut off all the phone lines and hot water to the building. But that wasn't an issue for them because one of the protesters was able to build them a little fridge. And, you know, obviously a lot of them were deaf, so they just would have somebody who signed on the outside who would get information and would cite to them through the windows from the inside, so they knew what was going on in the world. The Black Panthers also brought them hot food, and everybody just supported each other. It was basically camp, because the majority of the protesters were from Camp Jened, so it was a good time. But anyway, this is a moment to tell you to go to Netflix right now and watch Crip Camp, because for some reason I hadn't watched it until now, but it's absolutely incredible. Please watch it. It's a documentary that follows camp life at Jened and then how that created this disability community that led to these movements, ultimately leading to the passage of the ADA in 1990, and it's incredible and you should go watch it. So anyway, Section 504 was signed. It was a huge win, but then at the same time, we do need to acknowledge how sad it is that basic human rights are a huge win and it took a 25-day protest to get them. That's rather unfortunate. Also, it only covered federally funded programs and buildings. Now, in 1978, the National Council on Disability was established, and this was also the same year as the We Will Ride protests in Denver, Colorado, protesting the inaccessibility of public transit by blocking buses with their wheelchairs and chanting, "We will ride," over and over and over again. The protest over the next couple of years expanded throughout the US and many other cities and ended up leading to the 1983 foundation of the Americans with Disabilities for Accessible Public Transportation, or ADAPT, which continued to protest for buses to have wheelchair lifts until the 1990 passage of the ADA. And ADAPT still exists today, but it focuses on attendant and community-based services for disabled people. 1982 was the landmark Baby Doe and Baby Jane Doe case. The origin of this case was two children from different states who were not given life-saving surgeries at birth and instead left to die simply because they were disabled, which led to public outcry. In 1984, the Baby Doe Amendment to the Child Abuse Law was passed, establishing guidelines for treating disabled newborns. In 1988, we have my favorite protest of all time that I'm so incredibly excited to finally get to talk about. So, the Deaf President Now movement. This began in August of 1987 when the president of Gallaudet University resigned to go work elsewhere, as college presidents do. Including my own, actually. Anyway, the search committee, by the end of the search, had about 67 applications, 9 of which were deaf. This was then reduced to 6 semifinalists, 3 of which were deaf. During this time, a group called the President's Council on Deafness, made of deaf faculty and staff of Gallaudet University, continuously advised the search committee to choose a deaf president. Several letters were sent to the committee, a petition signed by almost 200 faculty members was sent, and the NAD Broadcaster, which is a deaf newspaper, published a special edition full of articles supporting a deaf president. The NAD also sent individually addressed letters to every single senator and representative in Congress asking for their support of a deaf president of the college. Senator Bob Dole and Vice President George Bush both sent letters of support back. Now, there was this massive on-campus rally for a deaf president, and when the application pool was narrowed down to 3, 2 deaf and 1 hearing, advocates reached out to the hearing candidate asking her to withdraw her candidacy. So you'd think, logically, that they would choose a deaf president for the university, logically, because it would make no sense, after all of this going on, to pick a hearing candidate, if only because you know that it's going to be a publicity disaster. So, they picked the hearing candidate, and the students weren't really happy about that for obvious reasons. I remember how with the Section 504 protests that the people leading them were a group who'd gone to a disabled summer camp together. Well, there's a deaf summer camp, and it's called the Junior NAD Youth Leadership Camp, and 4 of those campers led this protest. So moral of the story, camp is great. But basically, as soon as the decision came out that it was going to be the hearing person early on a Sunday morning, hundreds of students marched to the hotel where the meeting was being held, and they burned publications of the news in various newspapers announcing this decision. 3 students were then sent in to speak to the board members, and there's considerable debate on whether or not the sentence, "deaf people are not ready to function in a hearing world," was actually said or not. But even if it wasn't, it was heavily implied, and the students left pretty angry. Monday morning, staff came to campus to find every single entrance blocked. Students had hot-wired buses, and they drove them to the front entrances, and they let out all the air in the tires. They used their own personal cars to do the same thing, and overall shut down the entire campus. So the board decided to have a meeting to try and just calm everybody down, and they basically said, "We hear you, but also we're not changing our decision." So all the students got up and left the auditorium and marched straight to the Capitol building, completely messing up rush hour traffic. So that was really awesome. As the week continued, the demands were set. They wanted a new deaf president to be named immediately. They wanted the chairman of the board to resign immediately. They wanted a 51% majority of the board to be deaf, because at the time the school board was less than a quarter deaf, and there would be no reprisals. On Wednesday night, the leaders of the protest went on ABC's Nightline with Marlee Matlin, who was famous for her performance in Children of a Lesser God. She's still famous for that, what am I saying? Anyway, she would win her Oscar for that like 3 weeks after this protest took place, and this coverage gained them nationwide support. That day, the faculty, who had originally been supporting the president that had been chosen, met and all voted against her. And the night after, on Thursday, the chosen president resigns. The next day, on Friday, over 3,000 deaf students, including busloads from the National Technical Institute for the Deaf in Rochester, New York, and from the American School for the Deaf, marched on the Capitol building. The day after that, they had a board buster day, where they specifically doubled down on their demands for a deaf board and on the resignation of the chair of said board, and they also had a very massive picnic. At the same time, members of the board were beginning to return to DC in order to meet. The night after that, on Sunday, March 13th, the chair had resigned and the university's first deaf president, I. King Jordan, was formally announced at 7:40 p.m. At 10 p.m., he gave his acceptance speech, and disabled people everywhere celebrated. If you've ever heard a deaf person quote the sentence, "deaf people can do anything but hear," it is from this acceptance speech. Almost exactly 2 years later was the Capitol Crawl, where disability rights activists demanded the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Over 1,000 protesters from 30 different states came to the protest, and after a day of rallying and singing whatnot, over 60 activists abandoned their wheelchairs and various mobility aids and began crawling up the 83 steps of the US Capitol building as other activists remained on the bottom and cheered them on. It was an instrumental part of the cause for the bill, and a few months later, it was finally passed in 1990. In 1993, we finally see the foundation for the neurodivergency movement. One of the founders of Autism Network International, Jim Sinclair, spoke at an international conference on autism in Toronto about how autism isn't a curse, and specifically said, "Don't mourn for us." In 1996, a group is founded called Not Dead Yet, advocating against assisted suicide, which is doctors assisting ill people to end their lives. Typically really fuzzy on the whole consent and desire related thing, so it's really icky. And that group protested outside of the Supreme Court when they were hearing 2 cases of assisted suicide, and the ruling was that there is no constitutional right to assisted suicide. In 1999, we had Olmstead versus LC and EW, which won in the Supreme Court and was actually one of the most important civil rights decisions for disabled people in US history, because it required states to provide health services for disabled people in the most integrated setting, specifically reinforcing the rights of us to be able to live in a community and therefore preventing hospitals and programs from holding us against our will. In 2001, Virginia formally apologized for its eugenicist sterilization laws and practices in history, which is a very big deal. And in 2004, we saw the first disability pride parade in Chicago. In 2009, President Obama signed a law called Rose's Law, which removed the terms mental R slur and mentally R slur from federal health, education, and labor policy and replaced it with the term intellectual disability. It was named for a 9-year-old disability advocate with Down syndrome named Rosa, which is really cute, and I love that he named it after a small child. It's very unfortunate that this didn't happen until 2009, but you know, it's still a win. It's still a step. The next one is in 2017, and I actually very vividly remember it, which is super great. ADAPT activists fought to save the Affordable Care Act, which is Medicaid, by protesting in Senator Mitch McConnell's DC office, and the police were brought in and they arrested dozens of people, dragging them from their wheelchairs and forcibly removing them from the building. There was also a protest at Senator Cory Gardner's office in Denver, where they were there for 2 days before being forcibly removed as well. They ended up winning. The ACA was not overturned, but still, the protest was handled very poorly. And then the last thing that I have here on my lovely timeline is in 2020 when FDA banned the use of electroshock devices, which were still being used at the Judge Rotenberg Center in Canton, Massachusetts. That's an institution, and it has actually been condemned for torture by the UN, so that's really awesome. Since this ruling came during the pandemic, as far as I can tell from all the sources I read, it still has not gone into effect, unfortunately, so please be sufficiently mad about that. And yeah, in conclusion, go watch Crip Camp, like, right now, and how cool it is that we now know all of these things about disability history that we never would have known before. I mean, honestly, as I was researching this, I realized, like, I really love making YouTube videos because I never would have taken the time to like sit down and actually learn about these things and understand these things and know this history. So I'm really glad that I was able to. So, you know, genuinely thank you for being here and, you know, knowing that you're all keeping me accountable for actually making 2 videos a week and paying attention to things really helps me to be productive and forces me to learn more about myself and people like me, and I don't know why I'm doing so many things with my hands, but anyway, I like what I do and you're the reason I do it, so thanks. I'm gonna stop being sappy and wrap this one up. Thank you for listening, thank you for learning. Remember, your story isn't over. My hands are everywhere. Remember, your story isn't over, it has only just begun, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one, which for you is like 3 or 4 days from now, but for me, since I have pre-filmed a bunch for spring break, will be at least 2 weeks, so I'll miss you. I'm in a weird mood today. Anyway, bye!